today I'm going to talk about marine mammal facilities, the animals that live there, and their role in today's conservation landscape. And I want to start with the big picture, which is that, look, virtually everybody agrees that humans are the biggest threat to wild marine mammals, either directly through harassing and killing them, or indirectly through the many human practices that impact the environment that these animals live in. Humans are the problem. And because humans are the problem, we have to look for ways for humans to bring about the needed solution. Now, marine mammal facilities play two key roles in this endeavor. First, they provide the opportunity for research and expertise with these animals that is impossible to achieve in the wild. You know, before we had dolphins in marine mammal facilities, we didn't know the basics about them. The fact that they have echolocation, what's their gestation period, what's their hearing range, how does their diving physiology work, right? The vast majority about what we know about dolphin cognition, communication, physiology, perception have all been learned from studies in marine mammal facilities. And the thing to know about that is this basic information helps scientists interpret studies of wild behavior and forms the basis for conservation practices and policies, right? Just like research in any field, before you can design something to work within that system, you have to understand how the system works, okay? All right, studies in marine mammal facilities have also given us ways of assessing the health of these animals that are now used to assess stranded animals. And they've helped to develop an understanding of the effects of various stressors. So for example, how do various trace metals and PCBs, how do they work in the different tissues? Do they pass through the mother's milk from mother to calf? Again, important information for designing conservation practices and policies. All right, now, the second role that marine mammal facilities play, and in my view, just as important, is they provide a forum for the general public to experience these animals directly, to learn about them, to learn about the challenges they face in the wild, and to make the emotional connections necessary to inspire conservation mindedness. Now that last point is really super important, right? Because any sort of conservation practices that are going to impact these animals are eventually going to boil down to the millions upon millions of decisions of everyday men, women, and children. Now, how do we impact that, right? Well, we know that if you bring people into a facility like ours and you give them up close and personal experiences with these animals, they start to form a connection and they start to care. And it is that moment of connection and that moment of caring that's a start of conservation mindedness. It is not enough to just give people information. People have to care enough to actually go out and do something with that information. All right, so big picture, humans are the problem. Marine mammal facilities play two key roles in addressing that problem. However, from an ethical standpoint, any sort of benefits, whether it's to conservation, research, education, no matter how great those benefits are, you have to carefully weigh them against any potential costs to these animals that might come from living in marine mammal facilities. So let's talk about that. Is life in a marine mammal facility detrimental? What do the data actually say? Now, I want to start by giving you just a really brief snapshot of the facility where I work so that you have a sense of where I'm coming from. I work at a marine mammal facility called Dolphin Research Center, pictured here. At the moment, we have 24 dolphins that live at DRC, ranging in ages from 1 to about 52. 2 of those dolphins were collected from the wild a number of decades ago. 20 of those dolphins were born at DRC, or one of those 20 was born at another facility and transferred to DRC. And 2 of those dolphins were rescued from really horrible situations in the wild. In particular, one of them was the victim of a shark attack that left him orphaned when he was a baby, and the other was a victim of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill who was in really bad shape when he stranded. He's doing great now. They're both doing fantastic now. Now at DRC, we don't do scripted shows per se. Instead, we do a number of different types of dolphin sessions throughout the day, including research, medical and husbandry, sessions that are more show-like in the sense that they focus on physical types of behaviors and interactive programs. And no matter what type of session we're doing, we're talking about it. So we have narrators that talk to the public and tell them what's going on in a particular session, and or we have trainers or other staff members who are out with the public answering questions. Okay, so that's DRC. I also want to touch on what life is like in marine mammal facilities in general. And of course, the first thing you need to know is that in the United States, the vast majority of cetaceans who live in marine mammal facilities were born in marine mammal facilities, or they were rescued from the wild. There have been no wild collections since 1989. Now, in these facilities, they live in social groups, they have great physical and mental stimulation, and fantastic medical care, which of course all sounds great. But if it's also great, then what about all these various problems that you hear about animals that live in these facilities? What's going on there? Ooh, went back, wrong way. All right, so let's talk about some of those. One of the things that you'll hear is, oh my gosh, you guys force them to work all day, and you should retire them to sanctuaries instead of forcing them to work all day. So let's unpack that. What actually happens in dolphin shows and training sessions? Well, first, yes, it is true that dolphins participate in a number of training sessions throughout the day with a trainer. Yes, that much is true. However, while some people want to characterize that as work in a very negative connotation, I can tell you that from an animal caretaking perspective, we know that these types of sessions add to an animal's well-being rather than detract from it. They provide physical stimulation, mental stimulation, social stimulation, and there have been a number of studies that show that positive reinforcement training sessions have positive effects on an animal's well-being. Which sounds good, unless of course you think that we are somehow forcing these animals to do these things. But we're not, right? Animals have a choice. They always have a choice. The trainers try to make the sessions fun so the animals will want to participate, but I'll tell you, a dolphin at any point can and does refuse a particular behavior that day or swim away entirely. And when they do, nothing bad happens. That animal is still going to get its entire required diet regardless of what it chooses to participate or not to participate in on that day. Okay, but even if we change it to more neutral terminology and we ask it, is the question, say, for example, do you ask them to do stuff all day? Well, there's a data question, right? And that's a question we can answer. So how much time do we ask for their attention on a given day? Well, at DRC, we're very focused on data, so we thought, okay, well, let's look at that. So what we did is, on a given dolphin's data collection day, every time a trainer went down onto the docks to do a training session, we timed it. And we did that for all of our animals over multiple days, etc. And what we found is that in a 24-hour period, we were asking our dolphins to pay attention to us an hour and 34 minutes a day, which is a far cry from all day. All right, so that's one. Now let's talk about lifespans. Is it the case that dolphins and whales in human care have a higher mortality rate than their counterparts in the wild? What I'm showing you here is a table that Naomi Rose uses when she talks about this issue. And what you'll see in this table is that all 4 studies show that dolphins and killer whales have a higher mortality rate in human care facilities than they do in the wild. And I am not going to dispute these data. This is an accurate representation of what these studies show. However, if you look closer, you will see that all of those studies use data from 20 to 40 years ago, which means they also are including a lot of animals who went through the presumably really stressful process of moving from the wild to a human care facility, and they did so at a time decades ago before we knew nearly as much as we do today about how to take care of these animals. The point being that the demographics of animals in facilities today, like the ones I showed you with DRC, are really different and not represented in this table. So the question is, all right, well, what's the data today, right? What's going on today with mortality rates? So let's look at that. First, I want to look at killer whales, and what you see in that purple bar, that's a killer whale mortality rate from the wild from the previous table. And the blue bars are SeaWorld killer whale mortality rate over the past several decades. And you will see that, yes, you know what? 40 to 50 years ago, mortality rate was a lot worse in human care. But it's gotten progressively better until today it is virtually indistinguishable from mortality rate in the wild. How about dolphins, specifically bottlenose dolphins? Again, the purple bar you're looking at is wild dolphin mortality rate from that table. When you're looking at here, the blue bars is dolphin mortality rate over the past several decades. Same thing, yep, you know what, 40 years ago, it's true, dolphin mortality rate was higher in human care, but it's gotten progressively better. And in fact, in the last couple of decades, if anything, dolphins are doing better survival-wise than they are in the wild. Their mortality rate is better in human care. All right, third thing, and probably my favorite. What about this idea you hear sometimes that, oh, you know what? Dolphins are too smart to live in zoos and aquariums. In fact, maybe they're so smart that we should declare them non-human persons. Well, let's unpack that. Let's talk about that. The thing is, measuring animal intelligence is tricky, and it's widely misunderstood. So for example, people will hear a scientific result that dolphins and humans share a particular cognitive characteristic. To take an example from my own research, we're both fantastic imitators. And people will hear that and they'll say, wow, look, dolphins are just like us. But of course they're not, right? Dolphins and humans are separated by about 90 to 95 million years of evolution. And we've evolved in radically different environments. Whereas the ancestors of humans evolved first in the jungles and then in the savannas, the ancestors of dolphins went back to the ocean. And these different evolutionary paths have led to profound differences between us. Some of them obvious, some of them maybe not so obvious. So some of the ones that are relevant for today's discussion, of course, we've evolved radically different body plans, right? Where humans have all of these gangly moving pieces, dolphins are torpedo-shaped, which means that we are interacting with the world differently. We have hands to pick things up. They don't. We also perceive the world differently. We have eyes in the front of our head. They have eyes on the side of their head. They have echolocation. We don't. We have smell. They don't. So we're interfacing with the world differently. We've also evolved highly different neuroanatomies, right? So in dolphins, the cerebral cortex, that's that outer layer, is in fact bigger than ours, area-wise, with more folding, but it's also thinner. Humans have 6 layers of highly differentiated cell types in that cortex. Dolphins have 5 layers of more homogeneous cell types. We've also expanded the brain in different directions. Human cortical expansion happened in the front. Dolphin cortical expansion happened laterally to the sides. The projection areas from the senses is different. So in humans, the visual area and the auditory area are in different parts of the brain. And there's association cortex between them so they can talk to each other. In dolphins, the visual area and the auditory area are right up next to each other with no need of association cortex between them. The point being that our brains are organized differently, which means our minds work differently, both in terms of how the information gets into them in the first place and how that information is processed once it gets there. We have lots of relevant differences. Of course, we also have some really cool similarities. And those are interesting and those are important, not because dolphins are just like us, but specifically because they're not. So when we see these areas of similarity, that scientifically tells us something about the way that cognition can evolve. All right. So this idea of answering how smart is an animal on some global level is actually impossible, right? Animals have evolved in different environments and their brains have evolved to solve different kinds of problems. There is no global level of intelligence that makes any sense whatsoever. Instead, you have to look at more specific areas, such as imitation, memory, number concepts, things that you can compare across different animals. And when you do that, what you find is there are certain areas where dolphin thought processes are pretty sophisticated. And there are other areas where dolphin thought processes seem to be not all that sophisticated. And really important for today's discussion, there are areas in which there is a very clear disconnect between what science knows about particular areas and the story that's told to the public. So I want to finish up by talking about one of those areas that comes up in this discussion a lot, and that's this idea of mirror self-recognition. And I want to hit on 3 things. 1, how strong is the evidence for mirror self-recognition in dolphins? 2, what does that evidence mean? And 3, how does it relate to life in marine mammal facilities? Now, for those of you who aren't aware, the idea behind mirror self-recognition is when you put an animal in front of a mirror, what does it think it's looking at? Does it think it's looking at another animal, or does it realize it is some depiction of its own body? Now, in dolphins, there have been 3 studies of mirror self-recognition. 2 of them were considered inconclusive. 1 of them said that dolphins can recognize themselves in the mirror. Since that time, other scholars have come out and said, you know what? there were problems with that study in terms of the behavioral definitions they used and their controls. The upshot being that the evidence for mirror self-recognition in dolphins is not nearly as strong as it is in some other animals, such as apes. But let's suppose that's not true. Let's suppose everybody says, you know what, those data are fantastic, and everybody agrees that dolphins can pass that test. What would that mean? Well, it would mean that they could recognize their bodily self. They don't think that dolphin in the mirror is another dolphin. They realize it's a representation of its own body. Great. The problem is some people want to go beyond that, and they say, look, having a sense of self opens a gateway to a whole host of other cognitive capacities. The awareness of mental states, the ability to reflect on the past, project into the future, and so forth. But you need to be careful. Yes, having a sense of self is a prerequisite to those other abilities, just like the ability to stand up is a prerequisite to the ability to walk, run, jump, and do a pirouette. However, if I show you evidence that a toddler can stand up, I have not shown you evidence that that toddler can run, walk, jump, and do a pirouette. It doesn't come for free. Same thing here. Sense of self is a prerequisite to these other things. It doesn't mean they have them for free. But let's suppose that doesn't matter either. Let's just stipulate that dolphins do have these cognitive characteristics. To be clear, as a scientist, I have to, again, reiterate, we don't have evidence that they do. But let's suppose they do. What would that mean for the current discussion? And in particular, is there any evidence that having advanced cognitive capacities somehow means that an animal will do worse in a zoological setting? And the answer is no. Right? In fact, the weird thing about this argument is from everything that we know, the ability to learn really well and to have culture should mean that they adapt better to life in a different environment, not worse. Okay, so the upshot. Dolphins in marine mammal facilities provide opportunities for research that we can't get in the wild. They provide public education and a connection that is the start of conservation mindedness. And far from being harmed by living in marine mammal facilities, any piece of data that anyone wants to look at shows that these animals are doing great. They're flourishing.